Welcome to VCUarts Faculty Lecture Series. I'm your host, Aaron Anderson. This is an interactive event, so we'll have lots of time for questions at the end. That includes all of our online visitors. Raise your hand if you've ever had difficulty understanding someone else in conversation. You can put them down. Raise your hand if you've ever been even remotely worried that someone else anywhere might have a hard time understanding you. All right, good. So these are problems that actors have to deal with all the time. And today we're going to learn a little bit about what actors know that can also help you. Let me introduce our guest speaker. Karen Kopryanski is assistant professor and head of voice and speech at Theater VCU. She's taught and led workshops in Austria, Canada, Italy, Russia, Singapore, and Turkey, and has coached more than 80 productions in the United States, including It's a Wonderful Life, A Gentleman's Guide to Love and Murder, River Ditty, Crimes of the Heart, Cabaret, and many, many more. Prior to VCU, Karen spent 10 years on faculty at the Boston Conservatory, where she taught Shakespeare, Suzuki, voice, IPA, dialects, and speech in both the Bachelor of Fine Arts and Master of Fine Arts musical theater programs. While in New England, she also taught for the Williamstown Theater Festival, Commonwealth Shakespeare Company, Harvard University, Boston College, Brandeis University, Suffolk University, the Museum School for the Fine Arts, and teachers as scholars. As an actor, she studied with Canada's award-winning Old Trout Puppet Workshop at the Shakespeare Theatre's Classical Actor Summer Conservatory, which is badly named, I think, toured with the internationally acclaimed Das Puppenspiel Puppet Theater, and spent several summers with Shakespeare in Delaware Park in her hometown of Buffalo, New York. As a scholar, she is currently the reviews editor for the Voice and Speech Review, an international scholarly journal that boasts 30,000 downloads annually. And she is archivist for the Voice and Speech Trainers Association. Her co-edited book, Building Embodiment, Integrating Acting, Voice, and Movement to Illuminate Poetic Text, is set to be released by Routledge later this spring. Please put your hands together and help me in welcoming Ms. Karen Kopryanski to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Aaron. That was fantastic. It's kind of wild to hear everything you've done listed in about a 2-minute segment, so that was really cool. Good afternoon, everyone. I am honored to be included in this series of lectures and would like to thank the School of the Arts for creating this opportunity for us to share our work with each other, because I think these lectures have been really interesting. Thank you also to my chair, Bonnie McCoy, and to my associate chair, Aaron Anderson, and the Department of Theater for supporting me in creating this lecture. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that this lecture is taking place in Richmond, Virginia, and that VCU stands on the lands of the Powhatan Chiefdom, keepers of the Seneca Maca. I pay respect to their elders, past, present, and future. So today I'm going to talk about what actor training can teach us about accent and speech biases and how we might begin to reframe our thinking around our own speech as well as other people's. Everyone has an accent. How we speak is influenced by geography, anatomy, family, ethnicity, culture, and society, but there is no truly neutral speech. And language itself is changing all the time. In the words of John McWhorter, language is like a lava lamp. He says, at any given point, we do not see the present configuration of the lava clump as somehow better than the one 30 seconds ago. The joy is in the infinite variations that the clump can take, while at all times remaining consistent in its expressive motility. The methodology you'll learn about today, Knight-Thompson speech work, represents one of the most substantial strides made in the field of voice and speech over the last 20 years. It's being integrated into film, television, and professional theater productions, and is one of the most important tools we're employing at Theater VCU to decolonize and reshape the way we teach actors about accents, speech, and dialects. Its precepts can be extrapolated to the general public, and there are some valuable lessons we can all employ whenever we interact with others through speech. I would like to thank the Dean's Office for research funding that has helped me begin to incorporate this work into our curriculum. And I'd also like to thank the Office of Inclusion and Equity for the inclusion grant that enabled us to hire a Black female Knight-Thompson dialect coach with expertise in African accents for our production of Schoolgirls, or the African Mean Girls play. A little bit about me. I have been teaching voice and speech for nearly 20 years. I've been an actor for over 30. I completed my BA in theater at the State University of New York College at Oswego, and my MFA in voice and speech at the, Aaron, you think that name was long? The American Repertory Theater, Moscow Art Theater Institute for Advanced Theater Training at Harvard University. Yeah, I am an associate teacher of Fitzmaurice voice work, and I have completed all of my prerequisites for certification in Knight-Thompson speech work, or as we like to call it, KTS. As a voice and speech specialist, I wear many hats. As part of my recent tenure bid, I provided the following list to my committee to outline all of the concepts I've been called on to teach or coach over the past 20 years. It's a long list. So why did I choose to speak with you today about accents, accent bias, and speech? Last year, I participated in VCU's 9-month Becoming an Anti-Racist Educator workshop hosted by the Office of Strategic Engagement. And during that period, I kept encountering a wide range of news stories about accent bias, both here and abroad. And these are some of the headlines I saw and have seen since. As a highly regarded R1 university with an international campus, many VCU colleagues and students grew up in other countries or were raised in homes where English was not the primary language. And even for those of us who did grow up in the US speaking English, public speaking is still one of the most common phobias in our society, partially because expressing ourselves opens us up to the judgment of others. Voice is intimate. Speech is one of the primary conduits for sharing our inner life, our thoughts, our opinions, feelings, and ideas with others. And breath, which is necessary for speech, is the only thing that tethers us to the present moment. So it makes sense that our voices are something we want to take care of, we want to cultivate, and we want to protect. Voice can also be used as a weapon. Speech patterns are often used to exclude people from the conversation. Correcting others' speech or confronting others about their speech can be both intrusive and harmful. As an example, vocal fry is most often attributed to young women as an undesirable aspect of their speaking voice, even though many men, including This American Life storyteller and host Ira Glass, also use it. Focusing our ire on young women by ridiculing their vocal habits is a great way to ensure their silence. We all have preferences around speech. In some fields, jargon is an essential component of the culture. In others, it might be slang or nonverbal cues. Part of my job is to help actors rediscover the widest possible range of sounds available to them, whether they use them in a given moment or not. And it's crucial for me to consider how I teach those sounds. So I'd like to share with you a seemingly insignificant element of my own pedagogical training. Pedagogical training. This is an S. I'd like to get some full audience participation here by asking you to make the sound that this letter represents, and I will do it with you. We're all going to do it together. Those of you at home can do it as well. Ready? All together, 1, 2, 3. Fabulous. Now, let's take a look at how you realize this particular phoneme. I'd like you to arrange your articulators, your lips, your tongue, your jaw, in preparation to make this sound, and hold them there for a second. Using your proprioception, potentially a mirror if you have one available, and I'd like you to see what exactly you are doing inside the mouth. How open or closed is your jaw? Is your tongue raised or lowered? This particular sound is a fricative that releases a stream of air through a narrow opening. So where in your mouth have you created space to release that air? And in a second, I'm going to ask you to actually make the sound again. And I'd like you to notice two things, and they might be interrelated. So first of all, where is the tip of your tongue? Is it raised or is it lowered? And the second thing is, do you feel that stream of air hitting the back of your upper teeth or your lower teeth? So let's try it all together. Ready? And potentially one more time, just in case. Where is that air going? So now, a show of hands. How many of you felt the air on the upper teeth or felt your tongue tip up? Great, awesome. And how many of you felt your tongue tip down or felt that stream of air on your lower teeth? Fantastic, great. So no matter where your tongue happened to be, chances are you made a fairly recognizable S sound, correct? Further, where you put the sound into context of language, as in this, one of my favorite quotes, "Is it possible, turning these jests out of service, let us talk in good earnest. Is it possible on such a sudden you should fall into so strong a liking with old Sir Rowland's youngest son?" So when I say this, does it matter whether my tongue tip is up or down? Now, what if I told you that for more than 50 years, if you were an actor, you would have been taught that speaking this sound with your tongue tip down was wrong? And that even if you were born and raised in America and had spent your entire life speaking English, you would be drilled on how to do it the right way. And this was one of many speech adjustments that would need to be made. You're not supposed to round your lips too much when you say the sound R. You're not supposed to add any friction into your consonant clusters, so it should be dream instead of dream. And you really need to make sure that your T's are precise at the ends of your words, especially in consonant clusters like in ghosts. And we were told that not using these rules to neutralize our speech risked diminishing our intelligibility or confusing the audience's ear. Worse, I remember being told myself that if I didn't use speech sounds the correct way, I was not honoring the poetry of Shakespeare. As a result, my first experiences working with a voice coach on monologues and in plays were difficult because not only was I trying to inhabit the character and be in the moment and work with my scene partner, I also had someone in the room judging whether my back vowels were differentiated enough. And this also impacted my first experiences as a voice coach. It took me several years to really let go of the minutia and pay attention to things that really did make a difference. Things like connecting the breath to the thought. Because when most of us have an idea, the very first thing we do is we take a breath in so that we can express it. Making sure all questions don't become rhetorical ones. Because if the characters on stage already know the answer to the question they're asking, that really diminishes kind of the stakes and the dramatic moment that's happening. Sometimes I did need to coach things that were related to speech, in particular, those pesky t sounds, because theater spaces tend to swallow them. Athletes and musicians do not train to mimic others. Although they may try on their styles and they may learn from them, they train to be their individual best based on their anatomy, discipline, and interpretation. For years, though, actors were taught that the only solution to variations in speech was to make them all sound exactly alike on stage. So where did this prescription come from? It started with William Tilley, who I couldn't find a picture of, an Australian-born expert in elocution who reportedly did not like theater very much at all. Tilley's specialization was in the proper pronunciation of English, and in pursuit of this, he created an accent many of us will be familiar with, especially if you happen to love movies from the golden age of Hollywood. Tilley's original intention was to create a cultured dialect he called World English, and the accent he invented employed many speech sounds common to British received pronunciations, a few that were distinctly American, but combined, none of which really accurately described the way Americans spoke in everyday life. It was prescriptive in nature, telling you how you should formulate the sounds of speech. This accent was taught in wealthier schools, and some notable speakers included former President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, writer George Plimpton, and one of my favorites, poet Dorothy Parker. Now, there were linguists who disagreed with Tilley's methodology and spoke out against the idea of establishing a standard for speech. John Kenyon, author of American Pronunciation and the author of A Pronouncing Dictionary, was one such critic, and he went ahead and used his platform to establish his own model based on the speech of his home state of Ohio. Tilly and his disciples fought back pretty vigorously against those who resisted their practices. Some of his students ridiculed the idea of a multilingual America, going so far as to say, and this is a quote, "Faulty speech and foreign accent are indelible signs of social inferiority." One of Tilly's students in particular, Margaret DeWitt, wrote a book called Our Oral World as Social and Economic Factor, advocating for their training methods and refuting Kenyon in particular. In a review of the book, it was noted that two main ideas emerge. The first is the paramount importance and indefinite continuance of Anglo-American power, which must not be muddied by any blendings of other races with the Anglo-American race. I have the full review on another slide if you would like to see it after the presentation. This is important to note because this dialect was originally being created to be spoken by people in everyday life. And this tells you a lot about who exactly was being invited into that conversation. Now, speech in the American theater had a long history of being extremely stylized. This is a little bit of a recording from 1920. This is American actress Julia Marlowe, and I have to cut out of here and go over to YouTube to play this for you. So this is just a little recording of what theater speech might have sounded like before William Tilley.
Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo, deny thy father and refuse thy name? For if thou wilt not be but sworn my love, and I'll no longer dear Capulet. Shall I?
It's fantastic, isn't it? It's really great. Even in the US, British accents were broadly used on stage as a base for heightened language. So, I mean, the leap from this to what eventually became known as Good American Speech wasn't that far and actually was even something of an improvement. Good American Speech, also known as stage standard, mid-Atlantic, or transatlantic, maintained a heightened stylized quality, but audiences were used to that in the theater. And this, at least, the transatlantic at least sounded a little bit more conversational than this did. Now, one of Tilley's students was Edith Skinner. Skinner had trained as an actor and was instrumental in bringing Tilley's methodology to universities, first at Carnegie Tech, which is now Carnegie Mellon, then Juilliard, and then eventually to graduate acting programs. Even after Good American Speech was widely rejected as an option for the American public, Skinner successfully trained many young actors who went on to become speech teachers in their own right, and the methodology was passed down through the early 2000s. I know this because her book, Speak with Distinction, was one of the core texts in my own graduate program. I even still use it periodically because it categorizes words by sound, and so if I'm outlining pronunciation guidelines for a dialect, it can actually be really helpful. Now, by the time this reached me, Skinner's work was referred to as a tool to help us sound neutral on stage, even though that term, neutral, belies the fact that biases and preferences are inherent to the concept of neutrality. In my experience, even though it was framed as a dialect to be used on stage, student speech was often corrected in class while they asked questions or offered observations. And it implied that this was something they needed to categorically change about themselves. One of Skinner's students was the actor Kevin Kline. And in a 2000 PBS American Masters interview with Kline, he said, quote, "She would beat," and he used that hand gesture, "she would beat any regionalisms out of our speech. But if I went home at Christmas break and my friends said that I sounded phony, she said, change your friends," because she was determined to make classical actors of us. That was the advice. Change your friends. In 2020, VCU's own Dr. Tanya Pettiford-Waits noted in her own faculty lecture series, faculty lecture is part of this series, that she had just graduated from one of, quote, "the most prestigious conservatory programs in the country, and even though I had all of this incredible training and technique, I was missing something. Somewhere along the road, I lost myself. The act of making sound is vulnerable. The very first utterances we make as babies are those that communicate our most primal needs. I'm hungry, I'm scared, I'm happy, I hurt. As we grow older, we begin to discover that sound is not just transaction-based, but can be joyful, as you see here. Our parents join us in the playful usage of nonsense words, rhymes, and riddles, and as we play, we begin to shape our sound based on the world around us. The resonances we hear, the variations in volume and pitch. Our sound reflects our identity, our family, our culture, and our place in the world. Inevitably, at some point, we get taught that our voice is not always welcome, or that it should be tailored to fit the needs of those around us. Use your indoor voice. Don't you talk to me like that. Why are girls so shrill? The messages we receive continue to shape our voices, now beginning to limit the range of possibilities for self-expression. As we grow up and away from our parents, we then mold our speech to reflect that of our peers, rebelling against one set of parameters so that we can shape an identity that will help us fit in and be accepted in another. Somewhere, the ability to communicate need, like I'm scared, and the ability to find joy in words like balderdash and wang jangle is diminished. Speech becomes, as one of my teachers said, choreography we've memorized so well, we don't even know the steps anymore. And so when we take on the task of a new language, a new accent, a new dialect, we are very often approaching it without any awareness of where we are or how we got there. Now, I didn't travel abroad until I was in my mid-20s. Growing up in Buffalo, I did learn a bit of French from Canadian Sesame Street. And I even nearly minored in French in college until I was asked to read Ionesco's The Bald Soprano in French in a literature class, and my head kind of exploded. One of the first things I did learn as I backpacked through Europe was that sometimes you have to look ridiculous in order to get what you need. You have to risk mispronunciation, bad grammar, and being misunderstood. And I've had many opportunities to practice over the years, both in English and in other languages. And at first, my ego was a little bruised, but I also began to appreciate what these clumsy moments afforded me, an opportunity to learn to love language again. For example, in Spanish, esperar means both waiting and hoping. And I find that very heartwarming. If I'm in a restaurant in Quebec, I know to tell the waiter that I will take a glass of wine, not that I want one. And one of my favorite Hungarian teachers and directors will, at some point in rehearsal, ask his actors to make a pause, or in his words, make a pausa, not take a break. Considering language from a different perspective sparks feelings of both curiosity and delight. And when I teach in another country, even if I'm working with a translator, I need to choose my words carefully so that my core ideas aren't muddied by idioms that may not translate well. Loving language leads to curiosity about it, which allows us to find value in a wider range of options and choices. I can acknowledge that my anatomy, the anatomy of my vocal tract, will produce sound in a way that is vastly different from yours. And I know that the choreography you have learned so expertly is not the same choreography that I learned. Numerous pioneers have stepped forward over the years in attempts to democratize how we navigate our voices, including some of my favorites, Catherine Fitzmaurice, Kristen Linklater, Patsy Rodenberg, all of whom sought to free the voice from the inhibitions we'd placed on it over the course of our lives, and to encourage all of us to speak with more resonance, more honesty, and more freedom. In the realm of speech, one of my most influential teachers was Dudley Knight. Dudley's protege, Phil Thompson, had this to say about him, quote, "He took the elitism out of voice training while maintaining the rigor, which is a neat trick. And he merged scientific rigor with playfulness." Their methodology, now known as Knight-Thompson speech work, or KTS, redefined the way speech and dialects are taught to actors by focusing in on descriptive practices rather than prescriptive. Wherever a person begins, that is their home base. And that home base may be the choreography of another language. It decenters English as a universal starting point and takes actors through the physical actions of speech, including sounds that don't exist in American English. The process is rigorous and cultivates athletic articulatory skills that allow actors to make and use any speech sound they desire. Now, as someone who has been teaching voice and speech for 20 years, this can be a little daunting. Even though I understand the many harmful drawbacks of a prescriptive approach to speech, boy, was it easier to teach. KTS means that instructors and coaches need to work with the unique vocal tract anatomy of every student they come across. It takes time, discipline, and rigor to develop and to be present to as an instructor. In 2021, Andrea Caban, Julie Foe, and Jeffrey Parker released the first beginner's guide to KTS. The preface to this book includes a list of principles, perhaps, or precepts, possibly, which include the following, and this is a little bit of my paraphrase. Everyone has an accent. No one's speech is neutral. There is no good or bad way to speak. There is only what is good or bad for a particular context. Speech itself has no inherent qualities that could be assessed as good or bad. All humans have preferences. When those preferences become requirements for others, they become biases. The only baseline standard our role as storytellers requires is being understood. Intelligibility is a moving mark based on your target audience. It is not one truth held by one person or one group of people. Each one of these principles, perhaps, requires the listener to acknowledge the humanity, the inherent dignity in the person speaking. It also requires an awareness that our own preferences are not and should not be prescriptions for others. Accent biases are not about eliminating regionalisms or wanting everyone to speak alike. Our world is full of accented English that we are perfectly content to listen to. Accent biases are about othering, harboring assumptions about a person or a group of people because of the way they speak, and attempting to exclude people based on those assumptions. This sometimes happens when we mistakenly equate someone's accent with their fluency. It is perfectly possible to have a nuanced understanding of a language but still struggle with speech. Reading and listening are primarily intellectual pursuits, but speaking layers in the physical. Now, when it comes to studying accents and dialects, actors trained in KTS examine what are called the 4 Ps: people, oral posture, prosody, and pronunciation. And you'll notice that on this list, people come first, and pronunciation, which is the thing that people are most likely to harp on, comes last. I've heard other KTS teachers say they often add a 5th P into the mix, which would be practice. And personally, I might even add a 6th, which would be play. But we'll focus on the list that we've got. We begin by focusing on the people who speak in a particular dialect. In the words of psychiatrist and philosopher Frantz Fanon, every dialect is a way of thinking. Learning a new language or a new accent is not just a matter of swapping out one gesture for another. It is asking the dancer to relearn subconscious choreography to music they may not even know exists, using parts of the body in ways they didn't know were possible, and wearing clothes they've never worn before. Next, we have oral posture, which refers to the shapes we make with articulators, just like I did earlier with our S sound. When people refer to the quirks of British speech, they sometimes use the phrase stiff upper lip, and that phrase is telling you something about the oral posture of that dialect. How someone uses their lips, their tongue, their jaw. How much vertical or horizontal space is in the mouth. Posture is not a fixed point, but more a way of moving that's got its own unique home base. If you grew up speaking a language that has a lot of lip corner advancement, then that posture is likely to make its way into your pronunciation of English. The third on the list is prosody, which refers to musicality and inflection patterns, including things like rhythm and pitch. Vietnamese, Yoruba, and Cherokee, for example, are all tonal languages, and meanings of words can shift depending on their inflection. Babies actually learn to babble in the prosodic features of their home language. So your English will be impacted not just by the quality of sound, not just by the shape of the articulators, but by the rhythm and musicality you learned growing up. And finally, we get to pronunciation. And this is not about words in isolation, but in combination with one another. So a T sound made in one language may be realized differently in another. The speaker will try to transfer their understanding of that sound, their choreography, to any other language they learn. So combined, this is a lot to manage. As a professional who has coached more than 80 plays and films over the course of my career, I push back very strongly against criticisms of the way actors use accents, because what it often reveals is that the critic in question has no idea how deep this work goes. Even though research has shown that accents are largely permanent after the age of 12, many actors are expected to perform in dialect quickly, with little support and few resources, which, at the very least, violates the old adage about work: fast, cheap, or good, pick two. Now, it's true that as a listener, engaging with accents makes your brain work a little harder, but we always have the option to adjust and to help others adjust with kindness. Thus far, I've spoken primarily about the experience of speaking with an accent, but it is also a reality in the US that many people must navigate multiple levels and modes of communication on a daily basis by code switching. In the words of KTS teacher Alicia Richardson in the new book, Stages of Reckoning, asking others to code switch for us exacts a psychic toll on the speaker as well. Not only do they need to adjust their speech, they need to adjust their identities. And although the listener must stretch themselves to understand, it's the speaker who is taking the risk in an attempt to be understood. So, as I mentioned earlier, part of my graduate degree included a residency at the Moscow Art Theater. We were living in a dormitory that was shared by Russian students, but I did notice that we were having a hard time making friends with them. In Moscow in general, my attempts at speaking Russian were often met with exasperation, frustration, and impatience. But as I mentioned earlier, sometimes you have to take the risk in order to get what you need. What we discovered a few weeks later was that the Russian students weren't reaching out to us because this impatience, this frustration, wasn't just directed at foreigners, it was directed at them as well. It made me sad that the fear of ridicule was an obstacle to real connection and understanding, even though we eventually overcame it. Speech and accent biases reveal our expectations for others' self-expression. They shame others for being different or for being in the process of learning, even though after a short plane ride, any one of us might find ourselves in the exact same position. Making change around this requires awareness, a willingness to extend ourselves, and also the ability to challenge our own beliefs and continue to grow and change. Remember, someone speaking to you in a foreign accent, they're smart enough to know at least 2 languages, and were brave enough to do their job in a second. I'd like to close with 2 quotes from Dudley Knight. Even though he's no longer with us, I continue to be inspired by his wisdom, humility, and especially his rapier wit. This first quote is about patterns of speaking. It's always useful to learn new possibilities without ever stigmatizing patterns that the speaker brings to the training. And lastly, Knight had some advice for us as teaching artists, which I believe can and must be reframed for all of us. Anything we teach in the arts is based on some set of underlying propositions, which need to be examined, poked at, soundly thrashed, rearranged, dusted off, polished, and generally looked after. If we do this, then we can offer them as principles. If they are neglected and ignored, they will gradually atrophy into inert assumptions. And those, in turn, often turn into stereotypes and biases. One of the most important elements of an actor's job is cultivating empathy for the characters they play. When it comes to speech, accents, and dialects, this also means fully embodying another person's experience and living in their moments, perceptions, and mindset. I hope that revealing how deep this work goes helps you find a greater degree of empathy for their work and for people in your own lives whose anatomy, whose choreography, and whose 4 Ps are, quite naturally, different from your own. Thank you so much for your time.
Yay! Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you all. We will have questions. For those of you online, just put your questions in the chat or in a question and answer function. I'm going to start with one.
Great.
Which is specific to the theater.
Great.
Which is slightly different than, life in general.
Let me find my title slide, just so we don't have to stare at this, this quote. Because if there are words on the screen.
I think you should start with just the S. We look like superheroes.
There we go.
Good. So the question is, so when we work in theater, a lot of times there's an accent that's appropriate to the character,
Yes.
appropriate to the time and place.
Yeah.
And in my experience, one of the things we watch with beginning actors is after they've mastered the Skinner version, the sort of required speech patterns, we in the audience then watch the actors playing the accent rather than the objective, right? We watch people struggling with the accents. How do you go about, and I'm always amazed by actors in films who seem to be able to embody the accent so very well and so very easily.
Yes.
So that you're not seeing them do it, right? You're like, oh my God, he's British, how the hell did that happen? So I guess the question is, how do you, with bearing all this in mind, go about training an actor to be able to embody an accent that is indicative of a character other than themselves very quickly? Because as you know, you don't have much time.
Yeah, the turnaround is sometimes very quick. And I will say that in my job, I am a lot of the time called in to fix what's going wrong in a particular production. So that happens a lot as well, or called in at the last minute. I think the thing that if I was to change any part of this process, it would be that actors would begin speaking in dialect right away and begin to kind of examine their own, it's because sorry, I interrupted my own thought because I was thinking, the thing that I notice is that people are afraid to make mistakes. And so I think first and foremost, you have to cultivate the mindset that speech has no inherent quality of its own, right? It's not a matter of like one thing being better than another. It's just how you've learned how to do it. And so when you learn how to play, you actually open up the range of possibilities for you to do other things. So learning how to use different ranges of your of pitch will help you eventually learn dialects, right? Because I might not speak up here,
or even though I might not speak in my nose very much, right? Being able to do this is helpful in any other speech I want to do.
because I can target my voice the way that I want to use it, right? Without being afraid of being judged for it. And so I think that there's an idea of kind of like, it's not just about the speech, it's about allowing yourself to explore other sounds, explore sounding not like yourself,
Yeah, no, that's good. I think I speak for the entire audience when I say I wish you'd done your entire lecture
in this
that.
particular dial. Yes.
Do we have any questions in the audience? Here, yes. Here,
Yeah.
let me give you, there used to be a guy, do you remember?
Oh, there is a mic in the audience.
so good.
Yay.
Oh, no, we didn't have to do that. I feel so pressured. So my question is, in the process of when you're working on a show, in terms of working with actors, you're always, I feel like, going to run into different perspectives on what the sound has to sound like. A director might have a vision, you have a vision, the actor has a vision. So how is it in your experience, do you manage all of those, like, not to use this term, but to use all those voices coming at you and manage so that way the whole is better accessible? if that makes sense.
Absolutely, yeah. No, that does make sense. And I think there's a couple of things that go on there. One of them, I think, is that there are, it's funny because dialects are consistent and they are maddeningly inconsistent, right? There are things that we might do at one moment that we then don't do at another moment, or we might change our pronunciation of things from day to day. And so you've got to leave room for those things to happen, which is why I say being able to play allows you to kind of work with whatever is happening in the moment, right? But I think that there are going to be some features of the dialect that are going to be essentially really important. Prosodic qualities, musicality, and things like that are really, they are things that you need to play into. And people sometimes will look at things and go, oh, but my character wants to be very serious, right? So they're not going to use a lot of pitch differentiation in their character. But the problem is that if the prosodic feature of the dialect is that it needs pitch variation, you can't just then determine that somehow your speech is different, right? You have to actually use what the dialect tells you, rather than, oh, well, I'll pick and choose this and this and this, right? It's a way of, it's almost like, I sometimes think we just did Cockney in class with students, and I was thinking about the fact that, you can't just take your American self and encase it in Cockney pronunciation. The Cockney pronunciation has to be through all of you. It has to be through how you use the articulators. It's got to be in the pitch phrasing and the way that you use words, right? Because that person will have grown up with a different choreography than yours. So you have to honor the choreography, not just your impression of what the dialect is supposed to be, right? One of the interesting things in teaching phonetics is that we spend a lot of time teaching what people are saying, so to kind of acknowledge, oh, yes, this is what I'm doing. I'm lifting my tongue here. I'm retracting my tongue here. I'm advancing my lip corners here. But then when we move into working on dialect, it's not about what you are saying. It's about what you should be saying.
There's a
practice, yeah.
question online.
Yeah.
In your theater experience, what was the most complex accent you've ever had to develop for a character? I think that's more than just as an actor. I think that's just encountered.
So I've been lucky enough to do some really cool things. I once had to help an actor turn into a rhinoceros on stage in full view of the audience, which was fun, and we ended up approaching in the realm of like looking at like, okay, what sounds do they make, and then how do you begin to morph English toward that? I worked on a production in Boston at the Boston Conservatory called Alice at War. And we actually had two invented dialects. We had, one of the dialects was angel, and the other one was swirp, which was a kind of bird. And we actually had to kind of look at what the writer had created and then figure out how those sounds would kind of group themselves together in a way. We decided, for example, that the angel would have really wild pitch changes because their understanding of how humans communicate would not necessarily be what humans would expect. Right, and so that they as celestial beings would use more of what was available to them than we did. So we made choices like that. I think one of the hardest ones I've ever had to do, I did coach a Persian dialect for a production, and I was very lucky that one of the actors in the cast was Persian, and so was really able to kind of help with primary resources as far as that was concerned. And the thing I struggled with most there was that people's perception of what a Persian dialect is not really what a Persian dialect is. The expectation was that it was going to have more Arabic qualities to it, and it didn't. And so a lot of there was a bit of distancing from the audience because they didn't expect to hear what they heard. And that is something that I think that is always a bit of a struggle, is that you have to balance what you're doing on stage with what the audience can understand and what they're expecting to hear without taking them too much out of the moment or being too untrue to the original source. It's like walking a tightrope sometimes. Yeah.
Any other questions here? I have one more for you.
Yeah.
I love this. I love this model because so here's an example. I have a friend who's raised in the American South, trained as a classical actor at Guildford in London, married a Cockney woman,
Yeah.
and lives in South London. So he's got the rhythm. So when he talks, no one has any idea where he's from, right? He's got a little bit of this or this.
Yeah.
Or my brother taught English in Thailand. And he was one of 3 people. He spoke. My brother has a Southern accent. There was a Welshman, a South African, and I think an Irish person who were all teaching English to native Chinese speakers.
Yeah.
Right. So you think about those. Irish and Southern. Just the word wall.
Yeah.
There's 18 different ways of pronouncing it.
Yeah.
So when the children would come up to you and they would speak with the nasal quality. You would know that it was English, but you'd have absolutely zero idea what they're, so it's kind of like rhinoceros.
Absolutely.
But so the question is, when you're coaching somebody, is there one particular of those lists, of that list, the rhythm or the sounds or the posture, is there one particular thing that tends to be more hookish, like to hook into? Is there one of those that tends to help the actor get a grip on it, or does it all depend on the accent?
It's a good question. I think personally that posture and prosody are the 2 most important, which is also, I think, why they are where they are on this particular list of 4 Ps. I really think that if an actor is able to achieve a strong oral posture, a strong place to start from, which also sometimes includes hesitation sounds, right? Because hesitating in American English, is not going to be the same as hesitating in, say French, where the lips might be a little bit more forward and there might be a slightly different sound. And so I think that posture and then musicality, I think if you can get those 2, it forgives a lot of other things. Do you know what I mean? Because the reality is that you're going to make mistakes, especially live. You just are. And so we have to be okay with that. But if you've got if you have a really strong sense of the physical placement of the dialect, and then the way that you are using the music of the language, those will always hook you back in.
So this is related to another question online. How do you fast track someone like a New Yorker like me, who needs to learn a difficult dialect, for instance, Xhosa in South African? So a New Yorker has to speak South African.
Yeah, Xhosa. I can't do the click. Sorry.
Yeah, I can't either.
Not well versed in my clicks quite yet. Is there a way to fast track? Yes and no, and it really depends upon the individual. I think one of the best ways to fast track is to speak in the dialect as much as is humanly possible. So you can't restrict your speech only to whatever text it is you're trying to learn. You actually have to riff, and you've got to riff a lot. Because as you riff, as you kind of speak this, and not necessarily in your everyday life, like we're not going out and trying to, like fool people into thinking I am something that I'm not. But when you're talking with friends, and when you're at home, and when you're in the car, and playing with the language, just kind of improvising in the language as much as you can, allows you to start to hear the mistakes you're making better. And once you once you can start correcting things, that's when you're starting to become a little bit more fluent in it. So yeah,
that's good.
I recommend to casts in general, if you're in a play that is in dialect, you have to start that dialect on the first day, and that you should be, when you are in the rehearsal room, that cast should be in dialect pretty much the entire time they're in the space.
It's like method acting for
acting for dialects, yeah.
Here's another question. You mentioned critics citing inconsistencies in dialects on film. Do you also notice such lapses, or do you think coaches do a pretty good job?
I will notice them. It doesn't take me out of the moment. I think that's kind of the question, is that when we kind of zoom in, when we hone in on something that's that specific, without really understanding the work that went into it, or because films also they shoot out of order, right? And so you may And you may be doing like the biggest scene first, and so the dialect may change over your experience of what's actually going on with the character. I will periodically notice it, but I also kind of, I in general try to have enough grace to be like, you know what, not my business, right? Like,
Kind.
I think it's my job to be, because I understand how hard this is. I really do understand how hard it is. If I do hear it, yeah, I try not to let it bowl me over. Because I figure if I was in that position, I wouldn't want somebody harping on me. Right?
Other questions? Other questions? Going once, going twice. Thank you very much, everyone
you.
here. Thank you, everyone at home.
Thank you, everyone at home.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And for everyone, one last time, thank you so much. I enjoyed this very much.
Thank you.
One round of applause. Karen Kopryanski, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Just drop the little, okay.
So everyone tune in next time in the faculty lecture series on April 4th. It's the final lecture of the series with our VCU Qatar colleague, Holiday Powers, for a talk on Moroccan modernism. Holiday Powers, Moroccan modernism. That's awesome. Sound like a superhero flick. All right, everybody. Thank you very much. Everybody stay safe, stay healthy. It was lovely. Thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
That was great.
Thank you, thank you.